Welcome back to another exciting lesson. In our last lesson, we explored the meaning of educational technology, where we examined key definitions, the difference between educational and instructional technology, and how these technologies influence teaching and learning. We also looked at the components of educational technology, the systematic approach to instruction, and the role of the teacher as an instructional designer. Here are the objectives for this lesson. By the end of the lesson, we should be able to define instructional media. You should be able to explain mode and then give examples of mode. We will talk about the history of media. So here, we will be able to describe the historical development of instructional media from traditional tools to modern digital technologies. And finally, we will look at the roles of media in teaching and learning. Let's delve straight into the lesson. The words media and technology are subsets of instructional technology. What is media? Let us look at the etymology of the word. Media means between. Between what? Media are the things that carry information from a source to a receiver. So anything that carries information from a source to a receiver is what is called media. So it serves as a link between the source and then the receiver. That is the meaning of media. So for example, computer is an example of media because it gives the user information in the form of text, pictures, videos, and many more. Also, a teacher in the classroom is an example of media. This means when we talk about media, we are not only talking about technological gadgets. Human-based media is also part. So the teacher in the classroom is an example of media because he conveys messages to the students. Textbooks that are used are also examples of media. This is because they carry messages from a source to the receiver. If media are the things that carry information from a source to a receiver, then what is an instructional media? Instructional media is when media are used for instructional purposes. Whenever we use these things in teaching and learning, especially in the classroom, they become instructional media. When they are used outside the classroom for different purposes, then we cannot call them instructional media. So, an instructional medium is the medium that is used for instructional purposes, that is, teaching and learning. Now that we know the meaning of media, let us ask ourselves, what about mode? What is mode? Mode is the stimulus presented to the learner. What is the meaning of stimulus and how is it presented to the learner? When we say stimulus, it is what the learner sees, what the learner hears, or what the learner interacts with. That is the meaning of stimulus. So the things that learners see or interact with is what is referred to as mode, the stimulus presented to the learner. So where will the mode come from? It will obviously come from the media that is used. So the media will provide mode. Therefore, mode becomes the product of the media. What the media, like computers and instructors, produce. This can be in the form of written symbols. Written symbols is an example of mode. This can be the words, the letters, the numbers that are written on the board for students. And who produced this particular mode? We can say the teacher, because it was the teacher who wrote these symbols on the board. Another example of mode is printed text. We can find this in textbooks. So textbooks produce printed text that can be interpreted by the student. Sound is also an example of media because it can be perceived by the students. Therefore, we can say that computer is an example of media. However, the things that computers produce, which the learners can see, hear, or interact with, is what is referred to as mode. So the computer can produce sound, it can produce written symbols, or printed text. In the same way, an instructor is an example of media. A teacher is an example of media. But the written symbols, that is the message that is being given to the students, become the mode. In the same way, in textbooks, the printed text is the mode, whilst the textbook itself becomes the media. Let us look at some components of instructional media that we are going to explore in this course. The first one is hardware. What is the meaning of hardware? These are the physical and mechanical or electronic tools used in instruction. So they are the tangible objects that are used to teach and to learn. For example, computers are tangible. When you take a projector to class, the projector is also considered as a hardware. So examples of the hardware include camera, projector, television, tape recorder. All these things are tangible. They can be perceived. But we also have an instructional component that is the opposite of hardware, and that is software. So what are softwares? These are the programs or content. The content can be in the form of audio, video, or text that provide instructional messages. So software is not tangible. A software includes programs or content that are produced from this particular media or this particular hardware. Apart from hardware and software, we also have another component called learning materials. Learning materials are the media used in instruction to facilitate learning. Who do you think will use learning materials? Is it the teacher or the student? Obviously, it is the student who is going to manipulate these learning materials to understand concepts that are being taught. So, the learning materials may include textbooks, video cassettes, or CDs. Anything that the learner will manipulate in order to understand a concept. Another component of instructional media and mode is teaching material. What are teaching materials? These are the media used by who? By the teacher to facilitate learning. That is the difference between learning materials and teaching materials. These materials are manipulated by the learners, but teaching materials are used by the teacher to facilitate learning. So the teacher can choose to use charts, real objects, projectors, mock-ups, or other media to facilitate learning. The last component that we would explore in this course is the delivery system or delivery equipment. So this refers to the entire setup needed to deliver a lesson. So this includes the tools that are needed to deliver a lesson, the people that are involved in order for a lesson to be delivered, and the systems, the classroom environment that must make it possible for lessons to be delivered. That is what is referred to as delivery systems. Now that we know the meaning of media, the meaning of mode, and the instructional components that we are going to explore, let us talk about the history of instructional media. Before we talk about the days, the names of people included in history of instructional media, it is important to talk about this. Learning has always happened in two main ways, even from the olden days. And believe it or not, both are still part of what we learn today. What are we talking about? We are talking about the two types of experience in learning. Let us first talk about the immediate experience. This is the direct interaction with a teacher or expert. So this is the kind of learning that happens when you are physically present with a teacher, expert, or even a peer. For example, Think of a child learning how to cook by watching and helping the grandmother. There is no screen, no textbook. It is real life, hands-on learning. So in schools, this looks like the teacher standing in front of the class explaining a concept, asking questions and guiding learners. What about the next learning experience? That is what is called the mediated experience. This is the learning through media like books, radio, or TV. Now, this is when the learning is passed on through a medium. So, these are examples of the medium. When you use books, radio, television, videos, or even computers to pass on learning, then we call it mediated experience. You are not in the same room with the experts, but you are still getting the message. Imagine a student learning how volcanoes erupt by watching a YouTube video, or a farmer gaining new techniques from a radio program. That is mediated learning. How have these two learning experiences worked together? From ancient storytelling around fires to today's online classrooms, humans have always used tools and media to help pass knowledge. The role of media throughout history has been able to bridge the gap between knowledge sources and then learners. It has supported teaching and made learning more accessible. Now that we know the two experiences in learning, let us delve straight into the complexities of the history of instructional media. Let us go on a quick journey through time to explore how media, the tools that we use to share ideas and teach, have changed from the earliest days till now. You will see how each step helped people learn better, faster, and more creatively. Anthropologists trace the evolution of media chronologically as follows. So, according to anthropology, this is how media has progressed through time. First is the cave drawings. Think of early humans sitting around a fire, drawing animals and symbols on cave walls. That was their way of teaching and storytelling, using visuals to pass on knowledge. It was simple but powerful. Imagine using pictures instead of words to explain something. That is how media started in the ancient days. Then it moved on to language. This was a big shift. People could now explain things, give instructions, ask questions, and teach each other directly. So learning became more interactive when language was used in teaching and learning. When paper and ink were invented, things changed again. People could now write things down, not just stories, but instructions, discoveries, and facts. So here we can say that knowledge could be saved, copied, and then shared to many people. Media evolved and then progressed towards the use of newspaper, making it possible for large numbers of people to read about what was happening in the world. Then came the telegraph. Then came the telegraph and the typewriter. This made it easier to send information across long distances quickly. Then came photography and motion pictures. People could now capture real-life moments, from science experiments to historical events, to facilitate learning. Then the invention of radio and television. These two turned the home into a classroom. You could sit in your living room and learn about space, history, and health. Then came the CDs. So the compact disc and then computers changed everything. Lessons could be recorded, stored, and played over and over. So learning became more flexible. Now there are computer networks, what we all call the internet. This has opened up unlimited access to information. All these progressions have made teaching and learning very easy and fun. So this shows how media developed from basic visual communication to digital platforms for instructional purposes. Let us discuss history based on time, starting from early 1900s. what was used as the principal instructional media in 1900s. Take notes because this section is examinable. Back then, around 1907, the term visual aids or visual education emerged. This idea was simple. If students could see what they were learning, they would understand it better. So, teachers that time began using visual aids like charts, pictures, maps, and slides. These slides are not PowerPoint slides. They were not invented that time. They were glass slides. Imagine learning about the map of Africa not just by hearing the teacher describe it, but by actually seeing it pinned on the classroom wall. It made a huge difference. So why did they use visuals in the 1900s, in the 1900s, specifically 1907? The purpose was to make learning real. So if there is a photo of an elephant, it is more vivid than just hearing about it. Also, it helped simplify complex concepts. Complex science processes or math concepts were easier to grasp with diagrams. It also supported instruction visually. So visuals acted like the teacher's assistant, helping explain things more clearly. Now let us keep in mind that this was before audio tools like tape recorders or videos. So it was all about visuals during that time. No sound, no voiceovers, just pictures doing the talking. So this period laid the foundation for how we use visual materials in teaching even today. This is the first point of history of media that we can trace from the early 1900s. It was all about visual education. Let us move on and talk about what happened in 1920s. In 1920s, audiovisual instruction emerged. This was a very excited moment because education started to get sound upgrade. With the invention of film, sound recording, and radio, the concept shifted from visual to audiovisual instruction in the 1920s. This was the era when technology began talking, literally, thanks to the inventions like what we have mentioned over here. So education evolved from just being visual to adding audio elements to it. Instead of just seeing charts or diagrams, students could now hear voices, listen to stories, and even follow along with lessons broadcast on the radio. So from 1925 to 1935, there was a rapid growth in instructional radio. Look at these children here. They are enjoying their instructional time. They are learning from the comfort of their homes due to the invention of radio technology in teaching and learning. So schools across regions started using educational radio programs to support learning, and it helped reach students in remote areas who could not come to the classroom physically. But just as radio was becoming the star of the show, by the late 1930s, the use of radio declined due to newer technologies like television. So in the 1930s, television started entering the scene. As compared to radio, TV could deliver both sound and moving images, and naturally, radio began to lose its shine in the classroom. Still, 1920s marked a big turning point. It showed the world that media could do more than decorate lessons. It could actually deliver the lesson itself. So schools in the developed countries preferred using the television because they had access to it and it was more effective than the radio. Now that we've talked about the media used in 1900s and 1920s through to the 1930s, let us move on to talk about how media also evolved after World War. During World War II, media use declined due to limited equipment. What do you think caused the limited equipment? Because obviously there was war. Well, during the war itself, the use of media in education actually took a dip. Why? because most of the equipment and resources were redirected to support the war efforts. So there was just not enough to go around for schools. But here is the twist. Even though media used in schools slowed down, some great innovations were happening behind the scenes, especially in the military. Overhead projectors, for example, were developed to brief soldiers quickly and clearly. This became one of the first real steps towards projected visuals in instruction. It occurred during the World War. Then, once the war ended in 1945, everything changed. There was a huge boom in audiovisual instruction, especially in the military and industries. People realized how powerful media could be, not just for fighting wars, but for educating workers, training employees, and teaching more efficiently. So in the late 1940s, media wasn't just back. It was bigger and better. It was here to stay. So although this overhead projector was purposely for the military, but they saw that there was a need to include it in the school setting, which changed the face of instructional media. Let us progress. After the World War, in the 1950s, what occurred? There was rise of communication models. We talked about this in our first video, Chapter 1 of Educational Technology. In the 1950s, something interesting happened in education. People started thinking beyond just using media to teach. They wanted to understand how communication actually works. This placed emphasis on communication theory. There was the involvement of sender, message, medium, and receiver. With this understanding, teachers and instructional designers became more intentional about which media to use and why, depending on who they were teaching and what message it was. We are still in the 1950s. Let us see the breakthrough. That was the instructional television and B.F. Skinner's teaching machine. This was invented in the 1950s. Television became a huge part of teaching. Schools started using videotapes. To broadcast lessons, especially in places where there were not enough trained teachers. And in 1958, B.F. Skinner introduced the teaching machine based on the reinforcement theory. He was a psychologist, and the teaching machine was not just a fancy robot. It was a simple device that asked questions, allowed the student to respond, and then give feedback. We can see the student operating the teaching machine over here. So this machine posed questions, waited for the student to respond, and then provide immediate feedback. That is what led to programmed instruction. That is the self-paced learning in small units with instant feedback. So learning that is self-paced, broken into small chunks, and including immediate response. So learning started moving away from just listening to the teacher talk. It moved on to students actually engaging with the material on their own. It was the beginning of a learner-centered instructional approach. That was in the 1950s. And who played the major part? B.F. Skinner, father of modern technology. Let us proceed to see what happened in the 1960s through to the 1970s. That is the self-instructional system. So as we moved into the 1960s and 70s, learning became even more self-directed. You see, B.F. Skinner's teaching machine had done its job, but now educators were looking for simpler, more accessible tools. Instead of relying on a machine, they started using programmed texts. So these programmed texts replaced Skinner's machines. So instead of relying on a machine, they started using programmed texts. These programmed texts were special books designed to guide students step by step, just like the machine did. These books became so popular that publishers rushed to release their own versions. So during this era, new instructional tools emerged. One was the audio tutorial systems. These allowed students to listen to pre-recorded lessons at their own pace. Also, there was the personalized system of instruction, PSI. This model gave students the chance to progress at their own speed, mastering one concept before moving to the next. And the next was program tutoring. These were structured lessons, sometimes on a paper like this, sometimes using early computers that mimicked the guidance of human tutor. So all these innovations helped promote independent learning. Instead of relying heavily on teachers, students were gradually becoming active participants in their own learning, and this laid the foundation for something big on the horizon, that is the computer-based instruction. That occurred in the 1980s, CBI, computer-based instructions. So here we can see that some learners are using computers for instructional purposes. So in the 1980s, this was when computers really began to show up in classrooms, not just for typing or administrating work, but for actual teaching and learning. This new phase was called computer-based instruction. Take notes, it happened in the 1980s. So at its core, CBI was still based on Skinner's principle of reinforcement. You know, the cycle of presenting information, allowing a student to respond and giving immediate feedback. But what is the difference? It was all happening on a screen, not in a book or on a machine. Now computers were being used. It was interactive. So we can see the students here are actively engaged, interacting with what they are doing. Students could click, type, choose options and see instant results. That made learning more engaging and personal. So over time, CBI didn't just stay as basic question and answer formats. It grew into multimedia and even in hypermedia. It added sounds and videos, images and clickable links to explore topics more deeply. Now that we've been able to trace the history of instructional media from the 1900s, what about the present day? Our time is the blended use of media. Fast forward today, we are seeing more blended and flexible use of instructional media. Yes, textbooks are still very much in use. They haven't gone anywhere, but they are no longer the only source of knowledge in the classroom. You will still find tools like overhead projectors and even video cassettes for presentations. Self-learning is also on the rise. We also have things like commercial slides, audio tapes, and printed guides to support self-learning. Here is what is different now. The focus is no longer just on the teacher using the media to explain concepts. Instead, it is about giving students direct experiences with media, encouraging them to explore, interact, and take charge of their own learning. A real example is what was practiced in University of Education, Winneba. They delivered radio lectures, and they are still used to reach large classes effectively. In today's world, we are not throwing away the old tools. We are combining them with the new to create a richer, more flexible learning experience. Let us narrow it down to our context. How media has improved in the Ghanaian setting. We are talking about the post-independence educational focus, that is the 1957 when Ghana gained independence. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, education quickly became a top national priority. The government saw education as a powerful tool for national development and took some bold, meaningful steps to improve access and quality across the country. So here are the things that were done. First, free basic education. So government removed school fees for primary and JHS. It was a game changer, opening the doors of education to thousands of children, especially in the rural and low-income communities. Secondly, free textbooks for all students. Next, this wasn't just about handing out books. It was about making sure every child had an equal chance to learn, no matter their background. With free textbooks, students had learning materials they could take home, read and revise with. Third was the creation of district education offices. These were created to manage these things. First, the school infrastructure, that is, building schools across the districts. Next was equipment distribution, distributing equipment and learning materials. And the last was maintenance grants for basic schools. So they ensured that schools had the support they needed to stay functional. This kind of decentralized system made it easier for schools, even in most remote areas, to receive attention and resources. So in the 1970s in Ghana, it was a time when Ghana was still strengthening its educational system, and one of the key innovations of that decade was the introduction of learning resource centers. So the centers were established in places like Salt Pond, Ofinso, and Bagabaga. The idea was to make them accessible to teachers across different regions of the country. What was their purpose? Their purpose was to train teachers in designing low-cost instructional aid. So teachers could create their own low-cost instructional materials, especially in areas where resources were limited. So instead of relying on expensive imported teaching materials, teachers were equipped with skills to make non-projected visuals. What constituted the non-projected visuals? Examples were preparing cardboard, using paper, plywood to make teaching charts. It was easier that way, and it wasn't expensive. All these occurred in the 1970s when learning resource centers were established. Teachers also learned how to use milk tins to design science models, and also using drawings or real objects to make concepts concrete. But something happened. Unfortunately, over time, most of these centers stopped functioning effectively. Why? There were three factors that caused these centers to collapse. One was due to the lack of staff, lack of trained personnel to manage the centers. Two was inadequate funding to keep these centers running. And three was poor maintenance of the equipment and the facilities. So while the idea behind the learning resource centers was excellent, the challenge was sustaining them over the years. This part of our history reminds us that innovation in education doesn't always need to be high-tech. It can even be simple local materials that can be very powerful teaching tools. In 1974, there was the creation of CRDD. What does CRDD stand for? It stands for Curriculum Research and Development Division, and it was formed under GES in 1974. So this happened in 1974, and it was a big step forward in making sure what students were being taught was relevant, well structured, and nationally coordinated. So what were their functions? One of them was to develop syllabus. So one of their major roles was to create new syllabus for schools, and not just create them, but also trial them in real classrooms to see what worked and what didn't. So instead of guessing what should be taught, CRDD made sure the syllabus was tested, refined, and practical for both teachers and learners. Secondly, they also wrote textbooks and produced teacher materials. This helped promote consistency in teaching and learning. And third, they monitored implementation using subject organizers known as circuit officers. So these people managed how the curriculum and materials were being implemented and to offer guidance to teachers who needed support. Just after creating the CRDD, there came the establishment of Science Resource Centers in 1987. So this time in 1987, during one of the country's most significant education reform periods, as part of the reforms, the government introduced something called Science Resource Centers, SRCs for short. These centers were established, one per district. So every district had its own Science Resource Center. The features were they were equipped with science laboratory tools, charts, and chemicals. They also focused on senior secondary schools' science practicals. So it was basically to support science education at the senior secondary school level. It was very important because before these initiatives, many schools didn't have proper science laboratories. That made it difficult for students to understand science through practical work, which, as we know, is an essential part of learning. So the SRCs made it possible for students from different schools to come together and perform real science experiments. So this emphasized the importance of science and technology in the Ghanaian educational system. Just as we've mentioned, the Science Resource Centers was focused on senior secondary school science practicals. But it wasn't just the government pushing for change. Non-governmental organizations, which is known as NGOs, also stepped in to help. So some of them helped by establishing audiovisual centers in areas like Komboni in Volta region and Wa in Upper West region. These NGOs also sponsored equipment for colleges and community institutions. This chart summarizes the history globally. So there was the prehistoric period where people used cave drawings and language to facilitate instruction. There was also the ancient modern period where paper and ink and newspaper were used. In 1907, there was the introduction of visual education, where charts and maps were used to make learning more visual. In the 1920s, film, sound, radio, that is the audiovisual instruction, also emerged. So it stimulated thinking and audio support. In 1930s to 40s, overhead projectors were used in the World War II. And in just after World War II, there was expansion of audiovisuals in industry and even in education. So more equipment were used in teaching. In 1950s, that was when communication models and teaching machines were developed. And in the 60s to 70s, self-instruction systems were also put in place. So this was a shift to learner-centered methods. In 1980s, computer-based instruction was also introduced, and today we make use of multimedia and hypermedia, that is the blend of all the media available. Let us now discuss the roles of instructional media. What are the functions of instructional media? Here are the key roles. 1. Let us discuss the roles of instructional media. But what is the meaning of teaching? To teach is from an Old English taikan. It means to show, and it relates to token, that is a sign or a symbol. So, to put simply, Ulians expatiate this particular etymology as showing someone something through signs and symbols. What are the roles of instructional media? Why do we use them? 1. To gain attention and motivate learners. Before learning can happen, students need to pay attention. Media like videos, sounds, or colorful visuals can grab their focus and make them curious about the topic. 2. Media stimulate prior knowledge. Good learning connects to what learners already know. So using media like images or short stories can help bring back earlier lessons to help students link new ideas to the old ones. 3. Media presents learning objectives. Media can clearly show learners what they will be learning, like showing a title slide or goal at the beginning of a video. This helps students know what to expect. Media make it easier to explain things. For example, a diagram can show a science process better than just words. Video animations, pictures can help make lessons clearer. Next, media encourage student responses. Interactive media like using quizzes or educational games allow students to take part in the lesson, not just watch or listen. It helps them stay active and involved. Next, media also provide feedback. When students try something, they want to know how they did. Some media, like computer programs, give instant feedback, whether it was right or wrong, to help them improve. And the last one is that media reinforce learning through practice. Repetition helps ideas stick. Media like flashcards, recordings, or practice tools can let students review and practice as much as they need to build their confidence. In today's lesson, we have learned that instructional media are not just tools to decorate a lesson. They actively support learning. So whether it is a video, chat, or even a recorded audio, what matters most is how the teacher uses it. When used well, instructional media is going to make learning easier, more engaging, and more effective for everyone in the classroom. See you in the next video where we move to chapter 3. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, kindly do so that you don't miss our next upload.